My sister Victoria truly believed she had orchestrated the flawless holiday ambush to steal my only inheritance. She thought she was cornering a broke and desperate freelance data analyst who would fold under the heavy weight of family pressure. She had no idea that I had just finalized a $27 million acquisition of my software company, or that I had spent the last 3 months quietly purchasing every single distressed debt her husband owed. My name is Emerson Adams. I am 34 years old, living in Charleston, South Carolina, and this is the story of how a plate of dry turkey and a mountain of disrespect pushed me to dismantle my toxic family in less than an hour. Before I dive into the details of that explosive night, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the Revenge Order channel if you have ever had to smile through the pain of family members who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent historic district of Charleston, image meant everything to my parents. Our sprawling colonial estate was a pristine fortress of manicured gardens and towering palmetto trees designed to intimidate outsiders. Inside the house, the emotional climate was always freezing. On holidays, my mother Patricia spared no expense to put on a theatrical display of domestic perfection. This Thanksgiving followed the exact same script. The long mahogany dining table groaned under the weight of crystal goblets, gold-rimmed porcelain plates, and towering floral centerpieces. The aroma of baked sweet potatoes, slow-roasted turkey, and candied pecans filled the room. But the air felt impossibly thick. It was the specific heavy tension that always preceded a coordinated family attack. I sat quietly at my designated spot near the kitchen door, smoothing the linen napkin in my lap and controlling my breathing. That was the seat I had occupied since childhood, safely tucked out of the way so the spotlight could remain firmly fixed on my sister. While Victoria was celebrated as the golden child for marrying a flashy logistics executive and living in a gated harbor community, I was the resident disappointment. My parents routinely belittled my career, complaining to their country club friends that I was just a struggling auditor who could not secure a real corporate job. I never corrected them. I learned early on that sharing my ambitions only gave them ammunition. I kept my head down and worked 80-hour weeks, building a highly specialized artificial intelligence supply chain algorithm from scratch. Just 3 days before this dinner, I had sat in a sleek Silicon Valley boardroom and signed the final paperwork. A global tech conglomerate had acquired my algorithm for $27 million in pure cash. I sat in silence at the table, listening to my father Richard passive-actively ask if I needed leftovers to stretch my grocery budget for the week. The true reason for the heavy tension became clear before my father could even pick up the carving knife. Victoria sat across from me, her flawless makeup masking a frantic, nervous energy. Next to her sat her husband Preston, wearing a custom-tailored suit and swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. Without offering a holiday greeting, Victoria reached into her designer tote bag. She pulled out a thick manila envelope and slid it forcefully across the pristine white tablecloth. It stopped directly on top of my empty dinner plate. I looked down at the bold legal print visible through the plastic window. It read, "Property Quitclaim Deed." Victoria cleared her throat and squared her shoulders, looking down her nose at me. She announced to the entire table that I needed to vacate the historic downtown carriage house our late grandfather had left me by the end of the month. She spoke in a clipped, demanding tone, issuing orders as if dealing with an incompetent employee. The carriage house was a modest property in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. It was the only place in the world where I had ever felt truly safe and unconditionally loved. When my grandfather passed away, he specifically left the house to me, bypassing my parents and my sister entirely to ensure I always had a roof over my head. Now Victoria was casually demanding I hand over my only sanctuary. She took a sip of her sparkling water, unbothered by the sheer audacity of her demand. She declared loudly that it was time for me to stop being selfish and make a real sacrifice for the family. She explained that Preston had a groundbreaking new venture for his shipping company, and he urgently needed my unencumbered real estate to use as collateral for a commercial bridge loan. Preston nodded solemnly, adjusting his expensive watch, acting as though he were doing the world a favor by taking my home. He looked at me with an infuriating expression of manufactured pity, telling me that commercial finance was far too complicated for a freelancer like me to understand. My parents did not gasp in shock. They did not defend me. My mother leaned forward and nodded in eager agreement, her diamond earrings catching the light from the chandelier. My father crossed his arms and stared at me expectantly, waiting for my compliance. The ambush had clearly been planned well in advance. They expected the old Emerson to cry, argue, and eventually fold under the overwhelming weight of their collective disappointment. They did not know the woman sitting at the table no longer needed their approval. I let the envelope sit on my plate untouched, the warmth of my secret wealth wrapped around me like invisible armor as I prepared to watch them dig their own graves. The stark white paper of the quitclaim deed rested heavily on my porcelain plate, radiating a cold, sterile threat. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, refusing to grant my sister the satisfaction of a panicked reaction. As Victoria leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with expectant triumph, the chaotic sounds of the dining room began to fade into a dull, distant hum. My mind detached from the oppressive Charleston estate, drifting backward through a span of just 72 hours. The psychological whiplash between this pathetic holiday shakedown and the reality of my actual life was almost dizzying. 3 days ago, I was sitting 3,000 miles away, high above the sprawling grid of Silicon Valley. I occupied a leather executive chair inside a sleek, glass-walled boardroom overlooking the sun-baked California hills. The air in that room smelled of rich espresso and expensive leather, a sharp contrast to the suffocating aroma of candied pecans and artificial southern charm currently choking my parents' dining room. I was not the struggling, incompetent freelancer my family loved to mock at their country club mixers. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a highly profitable boutique tech firm. For 8 grueling years, while Victoria was busy coordinating floral arrangements and bragging about her husband leasing another luxury vehicle, I was writing thousands of lines of complex code. I spent 80-hour weeks staring at glowing monitors in cramped apartments, building a highly specialized artificial intelligence algorithm. My software analyzed real-time shipping data, predicting global supply chain bottlenecks with terrifying accuracy. It saved international shipping conglomerates millions of dollars in delayed freight costs. My parents had spent nearly a decade dismissing my grueling labor as a cute little computer hobby, entirely blind to the fact that major tech investors were quietly fighting over the rights to my intellectual property. Sitting in that pristine Palo Alto boardroom, I watched the lead attorney for a multinational tech conglomerate slide a thick stack of finalized contracts across a polished oak table. The document resting in front of me then was the exact opposite of the theft currently sitting on my Thanksgiving plate. It was an ironclad, historic buyout agreement. The tech giant had vetted my code, audited my client list, and offered an all-cash acquisition. I remembered reaching into my tailored blazer and wrapping my fingers around the textured grip of my grandfather's vintage brass fountain pen. It was the same pen I was touching in my pocket right now. My grandfather was a quiet, observant man who built his own modest wealth through raw grit. He despised the superficial, status-obsessed culture my parents worshipped. On his deathbed, he pressed that heavy brass pen into my palm, telling me to build my life on bedrock, not the shifting sand of social approval. Using his pen to sign away the rights to my algorithm felt like the ultimate tribute to his memory. I traced my signature across the heavy stock paper, feeling the smooth flow of the dark ink. There were handshakes, professional smiles, and the quiet, undeniable hum of ultimate victory. 10 minutes later, as I rode the silent glass elevator down to the lobby, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out and stared at the digital banking notification illuminating the screen. The wire transfer had cleared my private accounts. $27 million. A string of commas and zeros that instantly transformed me from a quiet data analyst into a financial titan. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the elevator, feeling a profound, untouchable peace wash over my shoulders. My future was secured forever. When I boarded my first-class flight back to South Carolina the next morning, my goal for the holiday had been remarkably simple. I wanted to survive Thanksgiving dinner, eat the dry turkey, and fly back to my new life on the coast. I planned to keep my profound wealth a strict, unbreakable secret. I knew the exact psychological makeup of my family. Love in our household was not an unconditional bond. It was a strict currency. If my parents or my sister discovered I was a multimillionaire, their endless barrage of insults would stop, but the dynamic would not improve. The disdain would simply mutate into a fierce, parasitic greed. They would view my bank account as a communal family asset, demanding endless handouts to fund their pristine, hollow lifestyles. I preferred their ignorance. I wanted to endure a few more hours of their condescension, smile through the subtle insults, and leave them to their fragile illusions. A sharp, impatient sigh from across the table pulled me violently back to the present reality. The cool California hills vanished, replaced by the suffocating wallpapered walls of my childhood home. Victoria was staring at me, her manicured fingernails tapping a frantic, irritated rhythm against the stem of her crystal water goblet. Beside her, Preston shifted his weight, his custom-tailored suit straining slightly across his shoulders. I looked at the quitclaim deed again. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement of their demand burned away my desire for a peaceful evening. They did not just want to insult my career anymore. They wanted to strip away the only piece of genuine security I possessed. They wanted to steal the carriage house my grandfather specifically left to me, ensuring I remained the vulnerable, dependent scapegoat for the rest of my life. My mother, Patricia, cleared her throat. A delicate sound, carrying a razor-sharp edge. She dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin and tilted her head, delivering a look of manufactured maternal concern. She told me I was taking too long to process a very simple request. She suggested that my isolated lifestyle was making me stubborn, and that turning over the property was the only logical step for someone in my precarious financial position. My father, Richard, poured himself another glass of dark red wine, the heavy liquid splashing against the crystal. He did not even look at me. He spoke to the floral centerpiece, stating that families must protect their strongest assets. In his mind, Preston's logistics company was a pillar of success, while my life was an acceptable casualty. I kept my hands resting gently in my lap, feeling the cool metal of the brass pen in my pocket. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch across the table, watching the subtle shifts in their body language. They interpreted my stillness as fear. They thought I was paralyzed by the sudden pressure, desperately trying to calculate how I would survive without the carriage house. They thought they had backed a helpless animal into a corner. The dramatic irony was a heavy, invisible armor shielding my mind. I was sitting across from a man who was begging for my real estate to save his fragile ego, completely unaware that he was attempting to rob a woman who could buy his entire shipping company with a fraction of her checking account. Preston let out a low, patronizing chuckle, mistaking my quiet observation for utter defeat. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, projecting the relaxed authority of a seasoned corporate shark preparing to deliver the final killing blow. He reached into his inner pocket, deciding that a display of sheer intimidation was not enough. He was preparing to insult my intelligence even further, setting the stage for a calculated bribe that would seal his own spectacular ruin. Preston kept his hand buried inside the tailored breast pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He was pausing for dramatic effect, wanting the entire table to focus solely on him. I decided to seize that brief window of silence to lay a carefully constructed trap. If I was going to dismantle their pristine social facade, I needed them to feel supremely confident. I needed them to believe their coordinated holiday shakedown was working flawlessly. I shifted my weight in the antique dining chair, deliberately letting my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. I lowered my gaze, staring down at the empty porcelain plate and the stark white quitclaim deed resting on top of it. I allowed a fabricated sigh to escape my lips, infusing it with just enough hesitation to sound genuine. I told the table that the property taxes on the carriage house had increased again this quarter. Keeping my voice soft and deferential, I offered a quiet confession. I mentioned that I was currently transitioning several of my freelance data clients and worrying about covering my basic overhead for the upcoming winter months. I painted a picture of a struggling, isolated woman buckling under the financial strain of maintaining a historic downtown property she could barely afford to heat. My parents swallowed the bait whole. The transformation in their body language was immediate and terrifyingly predictable. The stiff, awkward tension that had choked the dining room evaporated, replaced by a radiant, predatory satisfaction. My father, Richard, uncrossed his arms and leaned back, a smug, vindicated smirk spreading across his face. This was the exact narrative he had spent a decade cultivating. He needed me to be a failure. He required a cautionary tale to contrast against the soaring success of his eldest daughter. Hearing me admit to financial anxiety validated every cruel joke he had ever made about my career at his exclusive golf club. My mother, Patricia, reacted with a sickening display of manufactured sympathy. She tilted her head, her diamond earrings sparkling under the warm glow of the chandelier. She let out a soft clucking sound, the kind of noise reserved for a stray animal. Her eyes, however, remained cold and bright with triumph. She thrived on the strict hierarchy of our household, and my feigned vulnerability firmly cemented my place at the very bottom. Seeing that my parents were fully primed and eager to watch me surrender, Preston decided it was time to play the benevolent savior. He pulled a sleek, leather-bound checkbook from his inner jacket pocket and placed it squarely on the lace tablecloth. He uncapped his expensive fountain pen with a sharp, decisive click. He wanted an audience for his grand gesture of charity. With a theatrical flourish, Preston began to write. The scratch of the metal nib against the thick paper echoed loudly in the quiet room. He took his time, ensuring everyone at the table witnessed his magnanimous act. He tore the check from the binding with a crisp, satisfying rip. He extended his arm and slid the small slip of paper across the mahogany wood. It came to rest right beside the quitclaim deed, a final, insulting punctuation mark to their extortion attempt. I looked down. The check was made out to my name. The amount was written in bold, slashing numbers. $5,000. Preston offered a tight, condescending smile. He told me to consider the money a relocation bonus. He spoke in the soothing, patronizing tone of a wealthy benefactor speaking to a helpless dependent. He suggested that trying to maintain a historic Charleston property on a precarious freelance budget was an irresponsible fantasy. He then had the sheer nerve to recommend a specific rundown apartment complex in Spartanburg, a city hours away from the coast. He framed the suggestion as practical advice, but the subtext was glaringly obvious. He wanted to banish me to a lower-income zip code far away from their gated harbor community, so he would never have to be reminded of my existence. He was asking me to sign over a piece of prime downtown real estate worth well over $2 million. In exchange, he was offering me a $5,000 bribe and a bus ticket out of town. Victoria beamed with pride, reaching over to squeeze her husband's arm. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for tears of gratitude. She truly believed $5,000 was a life-changing sum for a woman like me. Before I could formulate a response, Patricia chimed in, glaring at me over the rim of her crystal wine goblet. The fake sympathy had vanished, replaced by a fierce, demanding maternal authority. She instructed me not to be selfish. She listed my perceived failures like items on a grocery receipt. She pointed out that I had no husband to support me, no children to provide for, and no real career trajectory to speak of. She gestured grandly toward Preston, praising him for building a legitimate shipping empire. She ordered me to take his generous charity, sign the legal document, and hand over the property without causing another scene. They were demanding I thank them for the privilege of being robbed. They wanted me to express profound gratitude as they stripped away my only inheritance and erased my presence from their immaculate lives. I stared at the slip of paper resting next to my empty plate. It took every ounce of physical discipline I possessed to hold back a cold, merciless smile. The layers of dramatic irony were stacking so high they threatened to crush the entire dining table. My parents were mocking my non-existent career, entirely unaware that the woman sitting mere feet away possessed a bank account that dwarfed their entire generational net worth. Victoria was celebrating a $5,000 handout, blind to the fact that my daily passive interest accrued more capital than her husband earned in a fiscal quarter. But the most spectacular irony belonged to the check itself. Preston sat there, his chest puffed out, radiating the unearned confidence of a Wall Street titan. He believed his theatrical display of wealth had successfully cornered his pathetic sister-in-law. He thought the heavy ink of his signature carried the weight of a booming corporate logistics firm. I looked at his smug face, knowing exactly what would happen when I finally pulled the trigger on his pathetic illusion. I knew the truth about the accounts tied to that leather checkbook. I knew the devastating reality he was desperately trying to hide behind his custom suits and country club memberships. I let the $5,000 bribe sit untouched on the white lace. I did not reach for the silver pen. The prolonged silence began to stretch Preston's nerves. The confident posture he had struck moments ago started to fracture just the slightest bit. His jaw clenched, and his eyes darted toward the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining room. He needed me to sign the deed tonight. He was operating on a ticking clock, and my refusal to follow his script was introducing a variable he could not control. Just as Preston opened his mouth to escalate his demands, a sharp, mechanical buzzing sound interrupted the tense atmosphere. The noise emanated directly from the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. Preston flinched, a rapid, involuntary muscle spasm that betrayed a deep-seated panic. He quickly reached into his coat, silencing the device before the second vibration could finish, and forced a hollow laugh to cover the sudden disruption. The seamless, wealthy facade was beginning to crack, and the real desperation hiding underneath was about to spill out onto my mother's pristine holiday table. The muted mechanical hum vibrated through the dining room again before Patricia even finished passing the porcelain tureen of roasted butternut squash soup. Preston thrust his hand into his tailored jacket, his knuckles whitening as he clamped down on the hidden device. He offered the table a tight, artificial smile, withdrawing his empty hand and picking up his silver soup spoon. Eager investors, he declared, aiming a practiced conspiratorial wink at my father. The markets are volatile right now. Wall Street never sleeps, Richard, my father chuckled, raising his wine glass in a gesture of profound respect. He praised Preston for his relentless work ethic, turning to shoot me a look of deep disappointment, silently comparing my supposed laziness to the booming ambition of his son-in-law. The phone buzzed a third time, then a fourth. Preston kept his eyes locked on his bowl, stirring the orange liquid with stiff, jerky movements. A microscopic bead of perspiration formed at his temple, catching the light of the overhead chandelier. The pristine veneer of the wealthy shipping executive was fracturing, revealing the terrified animal trapped underneath. I knew exactly who was calling him. My career in data forensics required me to understand the distinct, relentless rhythms of institutional debt collection. When an account defaults, the automated dialers follow a strict algorithm. 3 calls within a 10-minute window is not the pattern of eager investors seeking a lucrative partnership. It is the undeniable signature of an automated collection system attempting to reach an evasive debtor. The hounds were already circling his gated harbor property, and he was running out of places to hide. I kept my hands folded in my lap, staring blankly at the $5,000 check resting beside the property deed. My continued refusal to pick up the silver fountain pen was pushing Preston past his breaking point. The Benevolent Savior Act required a grateful audience, and my stony silence was ruining his script. He abandoned the charitable angle and shifted his strategy, pivoting toward high-stakes corporate intimidation. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms against the mahogany edge of the table. The sudden movement caused Victoria to pause, mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air. Preston dropped his voice into a low, urgent register, adopting the frantic cadence of a stressed titan of industry dealing with a catastrophic delay. "Listen to me." Emerson Preston began, tapping his index finger against the white lace. "I wanted to handle this gently because you are family. But the business world does not wait for hurt feelings. My banking syndicate requires the collateral from your carriage house finalized and filed by tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp." He let the fake deadline hang in the air, hoping the sheer urgency would bypass my critical thinking. He painted a vivid, fabricated picture of a highly lucrative port expansion project in Savannah, Georgia. According to his narrative, his firm was on the verge of acquiring a prime stretch of commercial waterfront, a deal that would elevate the family legacy into the stratosphere of generational wealth. To solidify his lie, he began throwing out a barrage of heavy corporate buzzwords. He spoke of agile capital deployment, mezzanine financing, trenches, and synergistic asset allocation. He articulated the syllables slowly, projecting the weary patience of a brilliant professor forced to explain macroeconomics to a slow-witted child. He intended to bury my supposedly simple, public school-educated brain under a mountain of financial jargon. He wanted me to feel so intellectually inferior that I would sign the legal document just to escape the humiliating conversation. My parents absorbed his vocabulary with eager reverence. Richard nodded along, his chest puffed out with unearned pride, thrilled to be associated with such a sophisticated businessman. Patricia dabbed her lips, her eyes darting toward me, conveying a silent demand to obey my intellectual betters. I did not blink. I listened to his frantic pitch, translating his corporate speak into the brutal reality of his actual situation. Agile capital deployment was a panicked euphemism for liquidating whatever you could find to stop the bleeding. Mezzanine financing meant he had exhausted all traditional lending avenues and was relying on predatory, high-interest loans just to keep the lights on in his warehouse. He was not expanding his operations to Savannah. He was constructing a fictional empire right here in the dining room to hide the smoking crater of his real one. Preston interpreted my steady gaze as stubborn defiance rather than calculated analysis. The muscle in his jaw ticked. He decided to weaponize guilt, raising the stakes to encompass the entire table. "This Savannah acquisition is a legacy-defining move," Preston stated, his tone sharpening into a direct threat. "I have leveraged my own reputation to bring this deal to the table. If you refuse to sign that deed tonight, the commercial bridge loan falls through. The expansion collapses. Hundreds of millions of dollars evaporate by tomorrow afternoon." He gestured grandly toward Victoria, who was now staring at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, perfectly playing the role of the victimized wife. "If you ruin this deal out of pure spite," Emerson Preston continued, his voice dripping with venom, "the financial fallout rests entirely on your shoulders. You will be the reason this family loses a historic opportunity. You will be the one who stole your sister's future." It was a masterful display of psychological manipulation. He was attempting to transfer the crushing weight of his own impending bankruptcy directly onto me. He crafted a scenario where signing the quitclaim deed was an act of profound loyalty, and refusing it was an act of unforgivable treason. He needed me to panic. He needed the artificial Friday deadline to trigger a desperate, unread signature, allowing him to rush to the courthouse at dawn and secure a fresh line of credit using my unencumbered equity. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour tang of his nervous sweat. He was a man standing on a trap door, begging me to hand him a rope. I looked down at the brass fountain pen hiding in the shadows of my pocket. I knew the exact reason he was terrified of Friday morning. It had nothing to do with the Savannah port expansion. Tomorrow marked the end of the 30-day cure period for a major commercial default. If he did not provide a massive injection of clean collateral to his primary lenders before the close of business on Friday, the federal receivership process would officially begin. His logistics firm would be seized. His assets would be frozen. The truth would hit the local financial papers by Monday. I watched him struggle to maintain eye contact, the desperation practically vibrating off his tailored suit. He thought he had outsmarted me, with a ticking clock and a flurry of corporate terminology. He had no idea that the ticking clock belonged to me, and the alarm had already been set months ago, triggered by the very algorithms he thought were just a waste of my time. He believed his secrets were buried deep inside institutional banking vaults, far away from my modest life, setting the perfect stage for the devastating truth I was about to drop directly onto his plate. Preston continued to lecture the dining room, his voice rising in volume as he painted a terrifying picture of the financial ruin I would cause by withholding my signature. He gestured sharply with his soup spoon, detailing the precise geographic advantages of the Savannah port, a location he had likely researched simply to make his lie sound more authentic. As his corporate buzzwords echoed off the floral wallpaper, the noise of his performance faded into a manageable background hum. My mind slipped away from the oppressive heat of the Thanksgiving table, traveling back through the timeline of his deceit. The origin of this confrontation did not begin with the presentation of the quitclaim deed tonight. The trap had been set exactly 90 days ago, triggered by the quiet, relentless logic of my own creation. 3 months prior, I had been running a routine diagnostic check on the latest iteration of my supply chain software. The algorithm was designed to predict global freight bottlenecks by analyzing microscopic shifts in regional capital fluidity. It scanned thousands of logistical data points, looking for inefficiencies that human auditors routinely missed. On a humid Tuesday evening in late August, the system flagged a severe anomaly right in my own backyard. A mid-sized logistics network operating along the southeastern seaboard was displaying critical structural failures. The data showed a company hemorrhaging cash, missing key delivery windows, and artificially inflating their operational metrics to secure emergency funding. I opened the detailed report intending to patch a potential flaw in my code. Instead, I found myself staring at the exact corporate registry details of Preston's flagship company. The numbers staring back at me from the glowing monitors were devastating. He had not expanded his operations in nearly 4 years. The booming shipping empire my parents constantly bragged about at their country club was nothing more than a hollow, decaying shell. He was trapped in a vicious cycle of toxic debt, shifting borrowed funds from one high-interest account to another, just to cover exorbitant margin calls on a series of failing suburban warehouses he had purchased during a brief market surge. The warehouses sat empty, bleeding capital through property taxes and maintenance costs, while he continued to lease luxury vehicles and fund lavish vacations to maintain his wealthy facade. Sitting in the glow of my monitors, understanding the precise magnitude of his failure, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew the exact psychological blueprint of my family. I understood their fierce dedication to preserving their social status at any cost. When Preston eventually ran out of creditors willing to fund his illusions, he would not confess his failures and ask for help. He would seek a silent bailout. He would look for an unencumbered asset he could liquidate without drawing attention from his social circle. He would come for the historic carriage house my grandfather left me. I knew my parents would eagerly assist him, viewing my independence as a threat and his success as a necessity. I could not rely on basic human decency or familial loyalty to protect my home. If I waited for them to strike, I would be forced into a defensive position, fighting a frantic battle against 3 coordinated aggressors. I needed to act proactively, utilizing the very tools they mocked to construct an impenetrable defense. My boutique tech firm generated significant operational capital funds I rarely touched due to my modest lifestyle. I decided to weaponize that capital. Working closely with a team of specialized corporate attorneys bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements, I established a blind trust registered in the state of Delaware. The legal entity was designed specifically to shield the identity of its true owner behind layers of corporate bureaucracy. I named the trust Obsidian Asset Management. For weeks, I monitored the slow, inevitable collapse of Preston's financial profile. I watched as his credit rating plummeted and his primary commercial lenders began issuing formal warnings of default. When the largest regional bank holding his primary notes finally reached their breaking point, terrified of carrying his toxic debt on their own balance sheets through the end of the fiscal year, they moved to auction the distressed portfolio. Obsidian Asset Management stepped in. Working entirely in the shadows, my legal team negotiated the purchase of his entire $4.5 million distressed debt package. The bank, eager to wipe their hands of his failing warehouses, sold the portfolio at a steep, unrecoverable discount. The transaction was finalized quietly. No public announcements were made. The transfer of the debt simply meant Preston owed a new, faceless corporate entity instead of his familiar regional bank. I did not just uncover his secrets, I purchased them. I legally owned the heavy mortgages choking his empty suburban warehouses. I controlled the exorbitant, high-interest leases on the luxury vehicles sitting in his pristine driveway. I held the promissory notes for the excessive personal credit lines funding his extravagant lifestyle. I was his primary, unquestioned creditor. I held the absolute authority to freeze his accounts, seize his assets, and dismantle his life piece by piece. The memory of signing that specific acquisition paperwork grounded me in the present moment. The power dynamic in the dining room was not just inverted, it was entirely non-existent. I was sitting across from a man who was actively attempting to extort a woman who literally owned his future. Preston finally paused his frantic Savannah narrative, reaching for his crystal water goblet to soothe his dry throat. He took a long, greedy swallow, his eyes darting toward me, searching for any sign of capitulation. He expected to see a woman broken by the sheer magnitude of the financial ruin he had just described. Instead, I sat perfectly upright, my posture relaxed, and my breathing steady. I offered him nothing. My continued lack of a panicked response seemed to infuriate Victoria. She interpreted my calm demeanor as an arrogant dismissal of her husband's brilliant business acumen. She could not stand the idea that I was not crumbling under the weight of their combined authority. She decided to escalate the conflict, abandoning the sophisticated corporate pressure tactics in favor of blunt psychological warfare. She knew exactly which buttons to push to maximize my isolation. She wanted to remind me of the vast, unbridgeable chasm between her elite lifestyle and my modest existence, ensuring I understood exactly who held the real power in this family. She smoothed her silk dress, preparing to deliver a blow designed to shatter any remaining resistance I might possess. Victoria sensed the momentum shifting. Preston's frantic corporate lecture had failed to produce a signed document, and the heavy silence from my end of the table was beginning to feel less like surrender and more like a quiet challenge. She could not allow that. She needed me to feel small, insignificant, and entirely dependent on their goodwill. Abandoning the complex financial jargon, she shifted tactics, deploying the weapon she had honed to perfection since our childhood, the lifestyle flex. She sat up straighter, pushing her shoulders back to ensure the diamonds resting against her collarbone caught the light of the chandelier. She turned her attention away from me and focused entirely on our mother, raising her voice so the words would bounce off the formal wallpaper and ensure I absorbed every single syllable. "Patricia, I haven't even had the chance to tell you the final details for our winter trip," Victoria announced, her tone bubbling with an artificial, breathy excitement. She placed her perfectly manicured hand gently over Preston's sleeve, a physical display of unwavering support for her supposedly brilliant husband. Preston, recovering quickly from his Savannah monologue, puffed out his chest, allowing a modest, self-satisfied smile to touch his lips. He was ready to play the role of the generous provider, eager for any narrative that distracted from the buzzing phone hidden in his jacket. Victoria proceeded to detail an upcoming vacation that sounded less like a family getaway and more like a promotional brochure for ultra-high net worth individuals. She claimed that just yesterday afternoon, Preston had finalized the booking for a 90-foot private luxury yacht charter. The vessel, she noted pointedly, would be theirs exclusively for an entire month, cruising the pristine waters around St. Bart's right after the New Year. She did not stop at the size of the boat. She painted a vivid picture of the sheer opulence awaiting them. She described the onboard Michelin-starred chef who would be preparing customized, locally sourced meals. She mentioned the private masseuse secured to relieve the tension Preston supposedly carried from managing his sprawling shipping empire. She emphasized the exclusivity of the harbor where they would dock, casually dropping the names of wealthy celebrities they expected to encounter. To finalize the illusion, she leaned forward, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, designed to be heard by everyone. She claimed the charter company had required an immediate, non-refundable cash deposit to hold the reservation through the peak holiday season. She tossed out a six-figure number as if she were discussing the price of a cup of coffee. My parents reacted precisely as Victoria intended. Patricia pressed a hand to her chest, letting out a soft gasp of delight. She immediately began cooing over the lavish details, praising Preston for his remarkable generosity and his ability to spoil his wife so spectacularly. She looked at Victoria with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration, the kind of maternal pride she reserved exclusively for displays of extreme wealth. Richard was equally thrilled. He set his soup spoon down and reached for his wine glass. He held the crystal aloft, offering a booming executive toast to his son-in-law. He praised Preston as a true traditional provider, a man who understood the value of hard work and the importance of rewarding his family with the finest things the world had to offer. The scene playing out before me was a masterclass in collective delusion. After basking in the warm glow of my parents' validation, Victoria turned her gaze back to me. The breathy excitement vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating smirk. She let the silence stretch for a beat, ensuring my parents were watching her deliver the final blow. It really is a shame your little freelance budget will not allow you to join us for even a weekend, Emerson, Victoria cooed, her voice dripping with venomous pity. St. Bart's is breathtaking in January, but I suppose someone has to stay behind and handle the practical things. Maybe you can use the $5,000 Preston so generously offered to upgrade your internet connection. I hear the Wi-Fi in Spartanburg is terribly unreliable. The subtext was glaringly obvious. She was using this imaginary display of extreme wealth to reinforce the rigid hierarchy of our family. She needed me to feel so financially inferior, so entirely excluded from their elite circle, that surrendering my historic downtown property would feel like a natural submission to my betters. She wanted me to accept my designated role as the pathetic, struggling sister who existed only to absorb their cast-off charity and marvel at their success. Sitting there listening to her weave this magnificent lie, the dramatic irony reached a sickening, almost suffocating peak. My parents were aggressively feeding a monster constructed entirely of quicksand. They were raising their glasses to toast a man whose custom-tailored suits, exclusive country club memberships, and pristine luxury vehicles were funded entirely by catastrophic high-interest loans. They were worshiping a mirage. The wealthy shipping executive they adored was actually a desperate debtor, hiding from aggressive collection agencies, terrified of the very real possibility of federal receivership. And the most spectacular layer of this irony was that I, the daughter they constantly belittled and mocked, was the single entity keeping that mirage alive. I controlled the debt. I held the leases. My signature on the Obsidian Asset Management acquisition papers was the only reason Preston was not currently locked out of his own office building. The sheer audacity of their performance finally crossed the line from pathetic, misguided arrogance to unforgivable cruelty. Victoria was not just defending her husband. She was actively attempting to destroy my future simply to elevate her own status. They were perfectly willing to strip away my only sanctuary, leaving me vulnerable and displaced, just to maintain a fictional narrative of supremacy. I looked at the $5,000 check, the stark white quitclaim deed, and the smug faces of my family. I felt the cool, textured grip of my grandfather's brass pen in my pocket. The time for quiet observation had passed. The trap was fully set, the bait had been taken, and the actors had delivered their lines flawlessly. It was time to pull the first thread and watch their pristine, carefully constructed reality begin to unravel right before their eyes. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, preparing to ask a question that would shatter the dining room. I carefully lifted my linen napkin from the edge of the table and spread it over my lap, smoothing the heavy fabric with deliberate, unhurried movements. The dining room was still echoing with the remnants of my father's booming toast and Victoria's breathless laughter. They were waiting for my reaction. They expected tears of humiliation, a frantic defense of my career, or a quiet, defeated surrender of my property. I offered them none of those things. I kept my posture relaxed, resting my forearms against the edge of the mahogany table. I turned my head, bypassing my sister entirely, and locked my gaze directly onto Preston. He was in the middle of lifting his crystal bourbon glass to his lips, his chest still puffed out with unearned pride. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject a single ounce of anger, sarcasm, or sorrow into my tone. I spoke with the flat, clinical precision of a diagnostician reading a terminal chart. How exactly did you fund a $100,000 maritime charter deposit yesterday, Preston, when your primary logistics firm failed its mandatory state liquidity audit last Tuesday? The words left my mouth and hung in the warm, food-scented air, sharp and unyielding. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. Preston's arrogant smirk did not merely fade, it vanished as if it had been struck from his face. The color drained from his cheeks in a rapid, sickening rush, leaving his skin a pale, chalky gray. His hand suspending the heavy crystal glass halfway to his mouth turned rigid. The amber liquid sloshed against the rim, and the ice cubes, which had been clinking a cheerful rhythm just a second before, stopped dead. He stopped breathing. The entire dining room plunged into a profound, suffocating silence. I watched the sheer terror flood his dilated pupils. He was not looking at a defeated freelance data analyst anymore. He was staring at a ghost. He knew my question was not a lucky guess or a random assortment of financial terms strung together to sound impressive. It was the precise internal language used by forensic accountants and state regulators preparing to liquidate a failing corporate portfolio. In the South Carolina commercial shipping sector, a mandatory state liquidity audit is the final safety net before regulatory intervention. Failing that audit does not mean a company is simply experiencing a slow quarter. It means the operating entity lacks the basic capital required to cover payroll, maintain insurance liabilities, or fuel its fleet. It is a death sentence. It is the precursor to having operating licenses revoked and doors padlocked by the state. I knew this because years ago, while developing the early stages of my artificial intelligence algorithm, I spent countless late nights studying regional compliance logs. I had to teach my software how to spot the microscopic tremors that preceded a massive logistical collapse. Preston was currently experiencing a magnitude 9 earthquake, and he had spent the last week desperately trying to hide the rubble from his wealthy social circle. Victoria, entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in the power dynamic, let out a harsh, brittle laugh. She rolled her eyes, waving a manicured hand in the air to brush away my statement. "Listen to her, Preston," Victoria scoffed, her voice dripping with entitled annoyance. "She is just stringing big words together to sound smart. It is nothing but jealous, made-up babble because she cannot stand the fact that we are successful. Tell her she is being ridiculous." She expected her husband to immediately agree to issue a sharp, crushing comeback that would put me back in my place and restore the pristine illusion of their wealth. She looked at him, an expectant, entitled smile plastered across her face. Preston could not speak. His jaw worked silently, opening and closing, as if he were trying to pull oxygen from a vacuum. A thick bead of sweat broke loose from his hairline, trailing down his temple to soak into the stiff collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He slowly lowered the bourbon glass to the table, his hand trembling so visibly that the crystal base rattled against the wood. My father, Richard, frowned. The booming patriarch who had just toasted his son-in-law's brilliance suddenly sensed a disturbance in his perfect hierarchy. He looked back and forth between my calm, steady expression and Preston's crumbling physical state. "What kind of nonsense are you talking about?" Emerson Richard demanded, though his voice lacked its usual commanding thunder. He turned to Preston, offering a lifeline. Just clear this up, Preston. Explain to your sister-in-law how commercial deposits work. Richard was begging for the facade to be reinforced. He needed Preston to reassert his dominance and prove that my quiet challenge was nothing more than the bitter ravings of a struggling freelancer. Preston tried to swallow, but his throat bobbed uselessly. He could not explain it away. He could not fabricate a story about offshore accounts or temporary cash flow restructuring. The specific date I had provided last Tuesday meant I possessed access to the restricted compliance registry. If I knew about the audit, I knew everything. He was staring across the table, realizing that the quiet woman he had despised and mocked for a decade had just casually dismantled his entire corporate existence without raising her voice. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked a steady, mocking rhythm. Victoria's artificial smile finally began to falter. The annoyance in her eyes morphed into genuine confusion as she stared at the side of her husband's pale, sweating face. Preston, Victoria prompted, her voice losing its breathy confidence. "Say something." He remained paralyzed. The bespoke suit he wore suddenly looked like a borrowed costume hanging off the frame of a cornered, desperate man. He was trapped in the wreckage of his own performance. He had walked into this dining room believing he held all the leverage, armed with a quitclaim deed and a ticking clock. Now he was entirely exposed, stripped of his unearned pride and drowning in the very real terror of impending public ruin. I did not let him catch his breath. I did not allow my parents the time to process the terrifying implications of his cowardly silence. Letting them sit in the discomfort was satisfying, but I was not interested in a prolonged standoff. I had initiated the demolition, and I intended to finish it with surgical precision. I shifted my gaze from Preston's panicked eyes down to the white lace tablecloth. Resting there, just inches from the edge of my porcelain plate, was the $5,000 check he had written with such a grand theatrical flourish just minutes earlier. The physical embodiment of his fake charity. The insulting bribe designed to banish me to a lower income zip code. The ink on the paper was dry, but the lies attached to it were still bleeding. I reached my right hand out, extending my arm over the table, preparing to turn his own weapon directly against him. The destruction of his imaginary yacht charter was merely the opening tremor. The real devastation would begin the moment I addressed the banking account printed on that slip of paper. The silence in the dining room had become a physical weight pressing down on the mahogany table. Preston's inability to defend his fake St. Bart's charter had cracked the foundation of the evening. But I was not going to let the foundation simply crack. I was going to turn it to dust. I gave him absolutely no room to breathe. I extended my right arm, reaching across the intricate lace pattern of the tablecloth. I brought my index finger down squarely onto the center of the $5,000 check he had written with such a grand, condescending flourish. I did not pick the paper up. Instead, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the man sweating across from me, I slowly pushed the slip of paper backward. It glided over the smooth wood until the edge bumped against the base of his crystal bourbon glass. I turned my head and looked directly at Victoria. The entitled annoyance that usually defined her features was dissolving, slowly morphing into a tight, frantic unease. She was staring at her husband, searching his pale face for the confident reassurance he always provided, and finding nothing but raw terror. Your brilliant husband is not just a spectacularly incompetent logistics manager, Victoria, I stated. My voice remained perfectly even, devoid of the emotional hysteria my parents always expected from me. It carried the cold, unforgiving edge of a judge reading a verdict. He is also a remarkably sloppy criminal. The word criminal hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. My mother, Patricia, let out a soft, sharp gasp, her hand flying to her throat, her diamond bracelets clinking together in the sudden movement. I did not let her interrupt. I addressed the paralyzed room, keeping my tone steady and analytical. I explained that the generous relocation bonus sitting by Preston's glass was nothing more than a prop in a desperate, illegal shell game. I detailed the precise mechanics of his failure so there could be zero room for misinterpretation. I explained that when a commercial entity suffers a massive covenant breach, failing to maintain the minimum capital reserves required by their lending agreements, the primary financial institution does not simply send a polite warning letter. They take immediate defensive action to protect their capital. 48 hours ago on Tuesday afternoon, the regional bank managing his portfolio executed a hard freeze on his primary operating accounts, I told the table. I watched Preston flinch as I named the specific day, confirming to him that I was tracking his collapse down to the hour. He cannot withdraw cash, he cannot process payroll, and he certainly cannot issue a $5,000 personal check to bribe his sister-in-law. The document he just signed with such a theatrical display of charity is entirely worthless. It is made of rubber. The reality of the situation crashed into the dining room. I laid out his entire pathetic strategy for my parents to digest. He was sitting at their holiday table, eating their roasted turkey, and actively committing a felony in their presence. He was not trying to help me relocate. He was trying to intimidate me into signing a quitclaim deed tonight, hoping I would be too grateful or too intimidated to deposit his fake check until after the weekend. His plan was to rush to the courthouse at dawn, use the unencumbered equity of my historic downtown carriage house to secure a predatory high-interest bridge loan, and rapidly deposit those borrowed funds back into his frozen account to cover the $5,000 bribe before it bounced. He was attempting to steal a multi-million-dollar property to cover a $5,000 lie, all to buy himself a few more days of pretending to be a shipping magnate. The pristine illusion of the golden couple instantly shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The contrast between the luxurious setting and the brutal truth was jarring. We were surrounded by towering floral centerpieces, expensive wine, and the trappings of old Southern wealth, while discussing check fraud and corporate insolvency. The man sitting in the custom-tailored charcoal suit, the man my father had just toasted as a true traditional provider, was essentially a squatter in his own life. Victoria stared at the worthless piece of paper resting against the bourbon glass. Her mind struggled to process the information. Her entire identity, her social standing in the gated harbor community, her country club memberships, and her lavish wardrobe were all intrinsically linked to Preston's perceived financial dominance. The idea that she was married to a fraud, a man writing bad checks at her parents' dinner table, was a reality her fragile ego aggressively rejected. "You are lying," Victoria whispered. Her voice was thin and reedy, lacking its usual commanding volume. She shook her head, a slow, frantic motion. She looked at me, her eyes wide and wild. "You are just making this up. You do not know anything about his accounts. You are a freelance web designer." She turned to Preston, grabbing his forearm with desperate, clawing fingers. She shook him, practically begging for a denial. "Tell her, Preston. Show them she is lying. Tell my father her claims are insane." But Preston remained frozen, trapped in a purgatory of his own making. He could not look at his wife. He stared down at his empty dinner plate, his chest heaving with shallow, rapid breaths. He knew I was not lying. He knew that the moment I mentioned the frozen operating accounts, I had pierced the final veil of his secrecy. He had spent the last 3 days dodging calls from furious vendors and aggressive collection agencies, terrified that the rumor of his insolvency would reach his wealthy social circle. Now, the absolute worst-case scenario was unfolding right in front of his father-in-law. My mother, Patricia, finally found her voice. It was sharp and trembling with manufactured outrage. She could not accept the collapse of her social hierarchy. If Preston was a failure, her years of bragging about him to her friends became a profound embarrassment. If I was right, the daughter she had spent a decade mocking had just exposed the greatest vulnerability in their family tree. "Stop this right now," Emerson Patricia demanded, her face flushing with anger. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "I will not have you sitting at my table, eating my food, and throwing wild criminal accusations at your brother-in-law simply because you are bitter about your own circumstances. It is disgusting." She was choosing the comfort of the lie over the terror of the truth. She preferred to label me a jealous, unhinged liar rather than confront the terrifying reality that her golden son-in-law was a desperate criminal. She needed the facade to hold. My father, Richard, however, was a different story. He was a prideful, arrogant man, but he was not entirely blind to corporate realities. He recognized the smell of panic radiating from Preston. He saw the sweat on his brow and the cowardly refusal to defend himself. The patriarchal dominance he usually wielded over the room faltered as he processed the detailed financial terminology I had just deployed. He realized that a simple freelance data analyst could not possibly know the specific internal mechanisms of a commercial covenant breach unless she possessed undeniable proof. The dining room had transformed from a scene of quiet extortion into a powder keg of raw, exposed nerves. The silence was gone, replaced by Victoria's frantic denials and Patricia's indignant scolding. The orchestrated holiday ambush had completely derailed, and the family members who had confidently cornered me just minutes ago were now scrambling to salvage the wreckage of their dignity. I sat back in my chair, entirely unbothered by the rising volume of their protests. I watched them struggle against the inevitable collapse of their narrative. I had stripped away the fake St. Bart's vacation and destroyed the insulting $5,000 bribe. I had exposed the fraudulent mechanism of his survival. The foundation was gone, but the structure had not yet fully collapsed. Victoria, unable to secure a denial from her paralyzed husband, realized the terrible truth was sinking in. The realization did not bring clarity. It brought a feral, unhinged desperation. She could not attack the facts, so she decided to attack the messenger, preparing to launch a hysterical offensive that would force our father to make a catastrophic choice between his two daughters. The revelation of the frozen bank accounts and the rubber check acted as a spark in a room filled with gasoline. The dining room erupted into a deafening cacophony of chaos. The suffocating polite tension that had defined the evening shattered, completely replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. Victoria lost her mind. The pristine, untouchable socialite vanished, leaving behind a frantic woman watching her entire identity burn to the ground. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the mahogany table with shocking force. The impact sent a sharp, jarring crack through the room. The heavy silver forks jumped off their rests, clattering loudly against the fine porcelain plates. The sudden violent noise startled my mother, who let out a sharp cry and shrank back in her chair. Victoria ignored the spilled wine and the rattling crystal. Her face, usually a mask of practiced, wealthy indifference, contorted into an expression of unhinged rage. Her perfectly styled hair trembled as she leaned across the table, closing the physical distance between us. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide and wild. "You are a pathetic, jealous liar," Victoria screamed. The volume of her voice was jarring, tearing through the refined atmosphere of the Charleston estate. The Southern Belle facade was entirely stripped away. "You have spent your entire miserable life resenting me. You resent my marriage, you resent my home, and you resent the fact that Preston is a success while you play on a laptop in a dusty carriage house." She was hyperventilating, drawing in ragged, shallow breaths between her shouted accusations. She frantically tried to construct a narrative that neutralized the devastating financial reality I had just exposed. She needed me to be the villain. She needed the room to believe that my calm, factual statements were actually the frantic ravings of a broken woman. "You are experiencing a psychotic break, Emerson," she yelled, turning her wild gaze toward our parents to gather support. "She is having a breakdown. She read some complicated words online, and she is throwing them around to ruin our holiday because she is so desperately alone. She cannot stand the fact that we are happy." Victoria spun back to her husband, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him hard. She demanded he perform his role. She demanded he crush me. "Say something, Preston," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. "Put her in her place. Tell my father she is a lunatic. Defend your company." But Preston offered her nothing. The golden son-in-law remained utterly frozen in his chair, a prisoner of his own deceit. The sweat that had started at his temple was now visibly soaking into the stiff white collar of his expensive silk shirt. He stared blankly at the ruined $5,000 check resting near his bourbon glass, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles trembled. He could not look at his screaming wife, and he certainly could not look at me. His cowardly silence was the most deafening confession possible in that room. He knew that engaging with me, attempting to deny the reality of the frozen accounts, would only force me to reveal even more damning details of his collapse. He chose the paralysis of terror over the risk of further exposure. The sight of her husband sitting mute and defeated pushed Victoria further into hysteria. She realized on a primal level that he could not save her. She turned her desperate, pleading eyes toward the head of the table, begging for the ultimate authority to step in and restore order to her collapsing world. My father, Richard, had reached his breaking point. The patriarch of the family could no longer tolerate the total disruption of his carefully maintained hierarchy. For decades, he had controlled the narrative in this house. He decided who was successful and who was a failure. He had designated Preston as the shining example of corporate ambition and relegated me to the role of the quiet disappointment. Witnessing me calmly dismantle the man he admired while his favorite daughter screamed in panic was an unforgivable challenge to his dominance. He decided he did not care about the truth. The truth was messy, humiliating, and threatened his social standing at the country club. He preferred the comforting lie, and he was prepared to use extreme force to maintain it. Richard stood up. The movement was sudden and imposing. He towered over his end of the long dining table, his broad shoulders casting a heavy shadow over the floral centerpiece. His face was flushed a dangerous dark red, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. He leveled a furious, authoritative glare directly at me, channeling years of corporate intimidation into a single, booming threat. "You have crossed a line you cannot uncross." Emerson, he roared. His voice rattled the delicate crystal goblets, vibrating with raw, unfiltered fury. He pointed his heavy index finger at me, mirroring Victoria's aggressive gesture. "I will not sit here and allow you to slander a respected shipping executive in my home. You are throwing around wild criminal accusations without a single shred of proof, simply because you are bitter and ungrateful." He slammed his fist against the table, a punctuation mark to his outrage. He leaned forward, dropping his voice into a harsh, menacing register designed to instill absolute fear. "Accusing a man of bank fraud is a serious legal offense," Richard warned, his eyes narrowed into furious slits. "Preston has spent years building a sterling reputation in this city. He would be well within his rights to have his legal team sue you for defamation by Monday morning. They will take whatever little money you have scraped together, and they will ruin you." He was using the threat of massive legal retaliation to force my submission. He believed that the prospect of facing high-priced corporate litigators would terrify a simple freelance data analyst into immediate compliance. He wanted to crush my spirit, ensuring I never dared to challenge the family hierarchy again. "I am giving you one chance to fix this," Richard demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. He gestured sharply toward the stark white document resting on my plate. "You are going to pick up that silver pen right now. You are going to sign that quitclaim deed, and then you are going to look Preston in the eye and deliver a formal, sincere apology for the disgusting lies you just told." He paused, letting the heavy silence amplify his final, devastating ultimatum. He prepared to deploy the nuclear option, the threat he believed would break me completely. "If you do not sign that paper and apologize this instant," Emerson, he growled the words, dripping with cold finality, "you are no longer welcome in this family. You will pack your things and leave. I will permanently disown you. You will be stripped of the family name, cut out of the legacy, and I will physically throw you out of my house tonight." The ultimatum hung in the air, toxic and heavy. He was demanding I surrender my home, my inheritance, and my dignity to a man who was actively committing fraud, all under the threat of permanent exile. He believed the fear of losing my family, of being cast out into the cold, would override my logic and force my hand. He thought the threat of isolation was his ultimate weapon. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full impact of his words. The red-faced patriarch looming over the table, the hysterical sister gripping the edge of the wood, the sweating coward staring at his plate, and the silent complicit mother watching from the shadows. They had shown me exactly who they were. They valued the illusion of wealth over the reality of truth. They were willing to sacrifice my stability to protect a criminal simply because the criminal wore a nicer suit. I looked at the silver pen resting near the quitclaim deed. I felt the familiar weight of the vintage brass pen hiding in my pocket. The memory of the man who gave it to me, the only man in this family who possessed genuine integrity, surfaced in my mind, providing the exact clarity I needed to deliver the final, crushing blow to their pristine facade. The dining room vibrated with the residual energy of my father's booming ultimatum. The threat of permanent exile hung heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of roasted turkey and Victoria's expensive perfume. The room was waiting for my reaction. They expected tears. They anticipated a frantic, trembling apology or a desperate plea for understanding. They wanted me to pick up the silver pen, sign the quitclaim deed, and grovel for the privilege of remaining in their toxic orbit. I did none of those things. The sheer volume of their panic did not break me. It insulated me. As Richard loomed over the mahogany table, his face flushed with unearned authority, my mind detached from the chaotic noise of the present. The suffocating heat of the Charleston estate faded, replaced by the sterile, quiet chill of a hospital room 3 years ago. The memory surfaced with crystalline clarity. I was sitting in a stiff vinyl chair beside a narrow bed, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a heart monitor. The room smelled of antiseptic and fading time. The man lying in the bed was my grandfather, the patriarch who built the modest wealth my parents now leveraged for social status. He was a man of quiet industry and sharp observation, entirely devoid of the pretentious rot that infected the rest of the family. He understood the fundamental difference between building a life and merely performing one. We were alone. Victoria had deemed the hospital environment too depressing for her delicate sensibilities, and my parents were busy coordinating a lavish reception for his impending funeral to ensure their country club friends witnessed their grief. I was the only one who stayed to hold his hand. I remembered his frail, spotted fingers reaching across the crisp white sheets. He signaled for me to lean closer. His breathing was labored, but his eyes retained a sharp, profound clarity. He did not offer platitudes or gentle farewells. He offered a brutal, necessary truth. He uncurled his fingers, revealing the heavy, vintage brass fountain pen resting in his palm. It was the pen he used to sign his first commercial lease, the tool he used to draft the blueprints of his life. He pressed the cool, textured metal into my hand, closing my fingers tightly around it. "They build their castles on sand, Emerson," he had whispered. His voice was fragile, but the conviction behind his words was unyielding. He was speaking directly about his own son, Richard, and the toxic, status-obsessed culture my parents worshipped. They construct these magnificent illusions, but there is no foundation. They will eventually drown in their own greed. They will sacrifice anything and anyone to keep the water from reaching their doors. He paused, coughing weakly, his grip on my hand tightening. He looked deeply into my eyes, ensuring I understood the gravity of his final instruction. "You build your life on bedrock," he commanded quietly. "You are sharper than all of them combined. Never let them make you feel small. Never let their noise confuse your logic. And when the time comes, Emerson, never let them take what is yours." That conversation was the crucible that forged my entire adult life. It was the reason I retreated into the quiet, demanding world of data forensics. It was the reason I poured 80-hour weeks into coding an artificial intelligence algorithm instead of attending vapid social mixers. His warning was the exact reason I had endured my family's relentless abuse in silence for nearly a decade. My parents and my sister interpreted my quiet demeanor as weakness. They believed my lack of a flashy corporate title meant I lacked ambition. They mistook my restraint for submission. They did not understand that I was not hiding from them. I was studying them. I was building my foundation deep underground, securing my financial independence layer by layer, while they continued to pile heavy, expensive stones on a sinkhole. The memory of the hospital room dissolved, and the stark reality of the dining room rushed back in. I was sitting in the same chair, at the same table, facing the exact scenario my grandfather had predicted. The water was rising rapidly around Preston's fraudulent empire, and my family was demanding I throw my historic downtown property into the flood to save him. Richard's threat to disown me was not a punishment. It was the final, desperate flailing of a man realizing his sandcastle was collapsing. I kept my hand buried in the pocket of my trousers, my fingers tracing the worn ridges of the brass pen. It felt warm against my skin, a physical anchor to the only genuine loyalty I had ever known. The contrast between the two writing instruments in the room was striking. The sleek, modern silver pen, resting next to the quitclaim deed, represented their desperate extortion. The heavy brass pen, hidden in my pocket, represented unquestionable ownership. I looked at my father, who was still standing, his chest heaving as he waited for my compliance. I looked at Victoria, whose tear-streaked face was a mask of furious entitlement. I looked at Patricia, shrinking into her chair but refusing to intervene. Finally, I looked at Preston, the catalyst for this entire disaster, sweating through his custom suit and staring blankly at his empty plate. They had made their choices. They had chosen the comfort of a criminal over the safety of their daughter. They had built their entire reality on Preston's fraudulent sand, and they were perfectly willing to let me drown to protect the illusion. It was time for me to finally let the tide roll in. I did not raise my voice to match my father's volume. I did not offer the tearful apology he demanded. I slowly withdrew my empty right hand from my pocket and placed it flat on the mahogany table. I shifted my posture, leaning slightly forward, completely ignoring the silver pen and the stark white quitclaim deed. "You do not possess the authority to disown me, Richard," I stated calmly, using his first name to sever the final thread of parental dominance. The flat, clinical tone of my voice cut through the residual tension in the room like a scalpel. "You cannot exile me from a legacy that does not exist. You are threatening to throw me out of a house built on lies to protect a man who is actively robbing you blind." Richard opened his mouth to roar another threat, his face flushing an even darker shade of red, but I did not let him speak. The time for his booming monologues had expired. I reached down with my left hand, bypassing my napkin, and grasped the handles of my structured leather satchel resting on the floor beside my chair. The heavy brass zipper made a sharp mechanical sound as I pulled it open. The noise was brief, but it carried a finality that instantly silenced the room. Victoria stopped her frantic breathing. Richard paused, his heavy hand hovering over the table. Even Preston lifted his head a fraction of an inch, a new, distinct terror flickering in his bloodshot eyes. They thought the climax of the evening was my father's ultimatum. They believed the conflict was over, pending my inevitable surrender. They had no idea that I was reaching into my bag to retrieve the weapon that would permanently level their entire world. The argument over the quitclaim deed was finished. The demolition phase was about to begin, and I intended to hand the detonator directly to the patriarch who had just tried to destroy me. The sharp metallic scrape of the satchel zipper echoed like a gunshot in the silent dining room. The immediate cessation of Richard's roaring threats created a vacuum, quickly filled by the collective shallow breathing of my family. They watched my movements with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. The script they had rehearsed for this holiday ambush did not account for my current behavior. My quiet, deliberate actions were directly contradicting the hysterical surrender they required. I reached inside the structured leather bag, my fingers bypassing my phone and wallet. I grasped the smooth, matte finish of a heavy, pristine black presentation folder. I pulled it free from the dark interior and lifted it into the warm light of the chandelier. I did not brandish it like a weapon. I handled it with the casual indifference of a courier delivering routine mail. I placed the folder flat on the lace tablecloth right next to my water glass. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Her tear-streaked face twitched, a sudden, desperate spark of hope igniting in her eyes. The sheer density of her denial was almost impressive. She genuinely believed the black folder contained a signed copy of the quitclaim deed, or perhaps a cashier's check representing my total capitulation. She assumed the threat of exile had worked, and my silence was simply the manifestation of utter defeat. She nudged Preston under the table, waiting for the document to be handed over so she could resume her role as the victorious wealthy socialite. I did not look at Victoria. I did not look at Preston. I kept my eyes locked on the patriarch still standing at the head of the table. With a firm, decisive motion, I pushed the black folder straight down the center of the mahogany expanse. It glided smoothly over the polished wood, bypassing the silver gravy boat, slipping past the magnificent floral centerpiece, and coming to a dead stop directly in front of my father. "Do not take my word for anything, Richard," I instructed quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, yet commanding the entire room. "Open the folder, read the first page out loud to your beautifully united family." Richard scoffed loudly, a harsh, dismissive sound meant to reassert his dominance. He muttered a string of derogatory words under his breath, condemning my supposed childish theatrics. He reached out and aggressively snatched the folder off the table. His movements were rough and impatient. He intended to glance at whatever fabricated proof he assumed I had printed from the internet, verbally shred it, and then execute his threat to throw me out of the house. He gripped the heavy black cover and flipped it open with a violent flick of his wrist. I watched the exact moment the brutal reality of the situation crashed into the patriarch. It was a spectacular physical transformation. The furious dark red flush that had painted his face while he threatened to disown me vanished, instantly replaced by an ashen, sickly gray. His broad, authoritative shoulders simply collapsed inward, as if the invisible strings holding up his powerful executive posture had been suddenly severed. The hand holding the edge of the stiff black cover began to tremble. It was not a subtle tremor. His fingers shook so violently the thick paper rattled against the wood. His eyes, which had just been glaring at me with absolute hatred, widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as they scanned the densely typed paragraphs. He was reading a document drafted on the heavy cream-colored legal paper of a major commercial banking institution. The top left corner bore an undeniable embossed corporate seal. Across the top center, printed in bold, uncompromising black ink, were the words, "Formal notice of commercial foreclosure and asset seizure." The booming executive voice of my father vanished entirely. He opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to demand another explanation, but only a dry, rattling breath escaped his lips. The silence radiating from his end of the table was so profound and terrifying that it immediately choked the residual anger right out of my mother and sister. Patricia stopped dabbing her eyes. Victoria lowered her hands completely. They both stared at Richard, utterly confused, and suddenly terrified by the sight of the untouchable patriarch, paralyzed by a single piece of paper. The visual contrast on the table was absurd and deeply poetic. On one side rested the meticulous, expensive illusion of a perfect holiday feast. On the other side sat the brutal, undeniable legal reality of their complete financial destruction. Richard could not tear his eyes away from the paper. He read the final paragraph, the section detailing the immediate freeze of all connected liquid assets and the impending aggressive liquidation of Preston's corporate shell companies. He slowly lowered the folder back onto the tablecloth, his hands shaking so badly he knocked over his own wineglass. The dark red liquid spilled across the white linen, but Richard did not even notice the stain spreading toward his plate. He looked up directly at his golden son-in-law. The man he had just toasted as a prime example of a real provider was sitting frozen in his chair, sweating through his expensive silk shirt. Preston could not meet my father's eyes. His jaw clenched tight, his entire body rigid with the absolute terror of a man who knew the hunt was over. Patricia reached out tentatively, her diamond bracelets clinking softly. She touched Richard's arm, asking him in a small, frightened voice what the paper said. Richard did not answer her. He could not form the words. He simply pushed the open black folders slightly toward the center of the table, an open invitation for anyone brave enough to confront the truth. I sat back in my chair, completely relaxed, surveying the magnificent collapse of their delusions. I had delivered the evidence, and now I decided to translate the dense legal text into plain, inescapable English. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and pointed my index finger directly at the second page of the document, still visible beneath the heavy black cover. Look at the total liability figure printed in bold ink at the very bottom of the page, Richard I instructed calmly. $4.5 million. I spoke the number slowly, letting the massive weight of it crush the last remaining hope out of the dining room. There is no highly lucrative port expansion project in Savannah, I explained, looking directly at Victoria, watching the final spark of her entitlement extinguish. The massive new venture he bragged about securing by tomorrow morning is a complete fabrication. Your brilliant husband took millions of dollars of his investors' money and gambled it on a series of failing suburban warehouses. He thought he could flip them during a market surge. The market shifted, property values plummeted, and his entire portfolio collapsed. I turned my attention back to Preston, stripping away the final shreds of his corporate disguise. He has been borrowing money from one bank to pay the massive interest penalties on a loan from another bank. I stated flatly, it is a pathetic shell game, and he ran out of shells last week. He did not need the carriage house to launch a new deal. He desperately needed the clean, unencumbered equity of my historic property, simply to plug a massive bleeding hole in his sinking ship before the federal receiver seized everything he owns by the close of business tomorrow. The absolute truth crushed the last breath of denial right out of the room. The fabricated story of a wealthy shipping executive expanding his empire was dead, replaced by the terrifying reality of a cornered debtor attempting to steal his sister-in-law's inheritance to survive the weekend. The majestic castle they had built on his fraudulent sand was officially washing away. But the demolition was not yet complete. Recognizing that the patriarch was broken and the truth was entirely exposed, the golden son-in-law realized his sophisticated corporate persona could no longer protect him. Stripped of his authority, the polished executive vanished entirely, leaving behind a frantic, desperate coward who immediately pivoted to the only strategy he had left, begging for a bailout. The stark reality of the $4.5 million liability hung in the dining room, a suffocating weight that crushed the remaining air from the space. The sophisticated, untouchable shipping executive vanished in the blink of an eye. The man sitting across the table was no longer a regional logistics titan. He was a cornered, sweating coward, stripped of his borrowed authority and drowning in the wreckage of his own deceit. Preston did not offer a word of comfort to his wife. Victoria was quietly weeping beside him, her face buried in her trembling hands, her pristine social identity fracturing into dust. He ignored her entirely. His survival instincts overrode any residual performance of the devoted husband. He needed a lifeline, and he immediately lunged toward the only remaining source of perceived power in the room. He lunged toward my father. Reaching across the corner of the mahogany table, Preston grasped the sleeve of Richard's tailored jacket. His knuckles turned white from the force of his grip. He leaned in, his eyes wide and bloodshot, exuding the feral, desperate energy of a man begging for his life. "Richard, you have to listen to me," Preston pleaded, his voice cracking into a high, reedy pitch that lacked any of its former baritone confidence. "The documents look terrible, I know, but it is just a temporary liquidity gap. The market shifted unexpectedly. The real estate values in the suburbs fluctuated. If you can float me a short-term bridge loan, just enough to cover the immediate margin calls tomorrow morning, I can restructure the entire portfolio by Monday. I will give you equity in the properties. I will make you a senior partner. He was attempting to hustle his own father-in-law right over the spilled wine and the ruined Thanksgiving feast. He was throwing out frantic promises of high returns and shared ownership in warehouses that were actively decaying, hoping Richard's ego would override his basic financial literacy. Richard simply stared at the hand gripping his sleeve as if a venomous snake had just coiled around his wrist. The booming patriarch was entirely paralyzed. He had spent decades building a comfortable suburban life on a regional management salary. His wealth consisted of home equity, a solid retirement portfolio, and a country club membership. He possessed the illusion of elite status, but he did not possess institutional capital. He did not have $4.5 million in liquid cash sitting in a checking account ready to wire to a failing logistics firm. Even if he did, Richard was a prideful man who protected his own interests above all else. He recognized a sinking ship, and he had no intention of chaining himself to the anchor. With a slow, deliberate motion, Richard pulled his arm backward. He extracted his sleeve from Preston's desperate grasp. It was a subtle physical rejection, but the implication was devastating. He was severing the alliance. He was abandoning the golden son-in-law to the wolves. Preston stared at his empty hand, the reality of Richard's rejection sinking in. The last door had closed. The panic vibrating through his chest mutated instantly into a feral, unhinged fury. Rejected by the patriarch and exposed in front of his wife, the cornered animal spun around and bared his teeth at the person holding the cage. He turned his blazing, bloodshot eyes toward me. He shoved his antique chair backward, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floorboards. He slammed both of his fists down onto the table, leaning his upper body over the floral centerpiece to close the physical distance between us. "You are a criminal," Preston snarled, a fine mist of saliva flying from his lips. He abandoned all logic, retreating into a desperate, fabricated narrative where he was the victim of a targeted cyber attack. "You hacked my secure network. You bypassed federal firewalls and stole my confidential banking data. You are engaging in corporate espionage just to ruin my reputation." He was breathing in ragged, heavy gasps, trying to project intimidation while radiating pure terror. "Who paid you to do this, Emerson?" he roared, his voice echoing off the walls. "Which of my competitors hired a freelance auditor to infiltrate my servers? I will have the federal authorities drag you out of this house in handcuffs. I will see you locked in a penitentiary for the rest of your life." He wanted to believe his own lie. He needed to believe that a quiet, unassuming woman could only defeat him through illegal, sophisticated sabotage. Accepting that he had simply ruined himself through staggering incompetence was a truth his fragile ego could not process. I did not shrink back from his sudden proximity. I did not flinch at the threat of federal prison. I held his furious gaze and allowed a tight, merciless smile to touch the corners of my mouth. "No hacking was required, Preston." I stated clearly, my calm tone slicing through his hysterical shouting. "I did not need to infiltrate your servers or bypass any firewalls to obtain your financial profile. Your records are practically an open book to anyone holding the correct legal authority." He shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion. "That is impossible. My regional lenders are bound by strict non-disclosure covenants. They cannot release my operational data to a civilian." "You are correct," I agreed smoothly. "They cannot release data to a civilian. But they are legally obligated to release every single page of your financial history to the entity purchasing your debt." I paused, letting the reality of commercial banking mechanics settle over the dining room. I decided to give him a brief, simplified lesson in high-level corporate finance. "When a portfolio manager acts as recklessly as you did," I explained, maintaining the steady cadence of a professor addressing a slow student, "and defaults on millions of dollars in commercial loans, the primary lending institution eventually runs out of patience. Banks do not hold on to terminal liabilities through the end of the fiscal year. They shed them. They package those distressed assets and auction them off at a steep discount to private equity firms. I watched the gears slowly begin to turn in his panicked mind. The fury in his eyes began to dilute, replaced by a creeping, profound dread. Your primary lender reached their breaking point last week, I continued. On Monday morning, they officially auctioned off the entire catastrophic mess of your defaulted loans. Your debt was purchased, the transfer was finalized, and the new holding company executed the freeze on your operating accounts 48 hours later. Preston swallowed hard. A visible lump bobbed in his throat. He knew exactly what had happened on Tuesday afternoon. He knew the name of the faceless, invisible corporate entity that had suddenly seized control of his life, locking him out of his own checking accounts and sending the formal notices of foreclosure. "Say the name, Preston," I commanded softly. He stared at me, his face pale and slick with sweat. His lips trembled as he formed the words he had been dreading all week. "Obsidian," he whispered, the sound barely carrying across the table. "Obsidian Asset Management." He spoke the name as if it were a curse. Obsidian was the monster hiding under his bed. Obsidian was the ruthless Wall Street conglomerate that had aggressively hunted him down and cornered him in a matter of days. He had spent the last 72 hours having his own lawyers desperately try to contact their representatives, begging for a settlement, and receiving nothing but cold, automated rejections. I nodded slowly, confirming his worst fear. Obsidian Asset Management. I repeated, letting the syllables ring out in the quiet room. You assumed they were a massive, faceless institutional giant located in a Manhattan skyscraper. You assumed you were just a line item on a sprawling corporate spreadsheet. I leaned forward, bracing my hands on the edge of the mahogany table, preparing to spring the final, inescapable trap. I looked directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. "Obsidian is not a Wall Street conglomerate," Preston I stated, infusing every word with undeniable, permanent authority. "Obsidian is a blind trust registered in Delaware. I am the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole proprietor of Obsidian Asset Management." The oxygen vanished from the room. "I purchased your debt," I told him, stripping away the very last shred of his dignity. "I own the mortgages on your empty suburban warehouses. I control the exorbitant leases on your luxury vehicles. You do not owe a bank anymore. You owe me. I am your primary creditor, Preston, and I own your entire life." The silence that followed was total. The sophisticated logistics executive, the man who had tried to extort me with a fake Savannah expansion and a bouncing $5,000 check, simply ceased to function. His legs gave out. He slumped backward, crashing down into his antique dining chair. He stared at me with hollow, defeated eyes, realizing the woman he had treated like dirt for a decade was holding the executioner's axe, and the blade was already falling. The trap had closed, but the real revelation regarding how a simple freelance auditor afforded his debt was about to shatter my parents' reality even further. The revelation that their designated failure of a daughter owned the multi-million-dollar debt choking their golden son-in-law triggered a profound cognitive collapse at the ends of the table. I watched my parents struggle to process the information. For 34 years, they had curated a rigid, inflexible family hierarchy. In their curated reality, Victoria was the shining star, the wealthy socialite married to a titan of industry. I was the cautionary tale, the struggling auditor who barely managed her monthly overhead. Their brains rejected the new data. The equation simply did not balance in their minds. A freelance data analyst sitting in a modest carriage house could not possibly possess the institutional capital required to purchase a distressed commercial banking portfolio. My mother, Patricia, was the first to vocalize the desperate denial. She let out a sharp, ragged gasp, shaking her head side to side in a rapid, jerky motion. Her perfectly styled hair shifted out of place, and her diamond earrings swung erratically. She looked at me not with newfound respect, but with fierce, indignant revulsion. "You are lying," Patricia hissed, her voice thin and reedy. She clutched the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white. "This is a sick, elaborate prank. You printed those fake legal documents from the internet just to ruin your sister's holiday because you are jealous. She pointed a trembling finger at the black folder resting near her husband. You do not own a holding company, Emerson, she scolded, attempting to force her maternal authority back into the room. You do not buy commercial debt. You play with spreadsheets and build cheap databases for local vendors. You barely afford your own property taxes. You are trying to humiliate Preston out of pure spite, and it is the most disgusting thing I have ever witnessed. She was fighting tooth and nail to keep me confined to the small, pathetic box she had constructed for me. If she accepted the truth, she had to accept that her own maternal instincts were entirely wrong, and her endless bragging at the country club was centered on a fraud. She needed me to be a liar. She needed the documents to be a forgery, so she could return to her comfortable, superior existence. I did not interrupt her tirade. I allowed her to exhaust her supply of venom, watching the frantic rise and fall of her chest. I understood her psychology perfectly. Words would never convince her. Rational arguments would bounce right off the thick walls of her social conditioning. She required undeniable, verified proof from an authority she respected more than her own intuition. She needed the validation of the institutional financial world. I broke eye contact with her frantic glare and reached back down into the shadows of my structured leather satchel. My fingers bypassed the remaining legal briefs and located a single standalone sheet of paper. It was not printed on standard office stock. It was a heavy, high-resolution, glossy document bearing the distinct weight of professional corporate communications. I withdrew the paper from the bag. The dining room fell quiet again, the frantic energy pausing as they watched my hands. I held the document by the corners and pushed it smoothly across the lace tablecloth. It glided past the ruined crystal glasses and the spilled red wine, coming to rest directly on top of the black foreclosure folder sitting in front of my father. I understand your confusion, Patricia, I stated, my tone, projecting the calm, detached patience of a seasoned executive. It is difficult to reconcile the daughter you have spent a decade mocking with the reality of invisible digital wealth. So allow me to clarify the source of my capital. I gestured toward the glossy page resting under the chandelier light. That is an embargoed press release drafted directly in conjunction with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I announced. I kept my enunciation crisp and deliberate. It is scheduled to hit every major global financial wire at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. By the time you pour your morning coffee, the entire corporate sector will be reading it. Richard stared at the glossy sheet. His chest heaved. The residual color from his earlier rage had entirely vanished, leaving his skin a sickly pale tone. He reached out with a hand that trembled so severely he could barely grip the edge of the paper. He pulled it closer, adjusting his posture to focus on the text. The bold headline spanning the top of the page left zero room for interpretation. It did not contain confusing corporate jargon or vague promises of future expansion. It was a clear, factual declaration of a historic Silicon Valley acquisition. The text detailed how my boutique artificial intelligence firm, the very same project my parents had dismissed as a cute little computer hobby, had been officially acquired by a massive, household name global tech conglomerate. Richard's eyes scanned the paragraphs, absorbing the verified details of the buyout. He read about the proprietary supply chain algorithm I had coded alone in my carriage house while they attended extravagant galas. He read the quotes from tech industry titans praising the revolutionary nature of my software. And then his eyes locked onto the final line of the summary paragraph. His jaw went slack. The paper fluttered in his unstable grip. He could not bring himself to read the figure out loud. The number broke his comprehension. Seeing his paralysis, I decided to deliver the final strike myself. I wanted the syllables to ring through the dining room, ensuring every person at the table felt the true, crushing weight of their mistake. $27 million. I spoke the undeniable number slowly, letting the zeros stretch out and fill the silence. An all-cash acquisition. The funds cleared my private accounts 3 days ago. The sheer magnitude of that figure hit the dining room like a physical shockwave. It was a number that existed entirely outside the realm of their affluent suburban reality. They measured success in leased luxury vehicles, country club dues, and mortgaged harbor properties. $27 million of pure liquid capital was not just success, it was dynasty money. It was generational power. It was the kind of wealth that made Preston's imaginary 90-foot yacht charter look like pocket change found in the cushion of a sofa. Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The indignant rage that had fueled her forgery accusations dissolved into a hollow, gaping void of profound shock. She looked at me as if I had suddenly transformed into an alien species. The daughter she had deemed a worthless embarrassment had secretly conquered the world, building an empire from a laptop while she was busy praising a criminal. Victoria stopped crying. Her tear-streaked face turned toward our father, seeking confirmation that this was just another cruel nightmare. But Richard was staring at me with a look I had never once seen in his eyes during my entire 34 years of life. It was not paternal pride. It was not frustration. It was pure, unadulterated fear. The man who had just threatened to throw me out of his house, who had demanded I surrender my sanctuary to save his fraudulent son-in-law, realized he was sitting in the presence of more liquid wealth than his entire lineage had ever generated in a century. The power dynamic did not just shift, it was incinerated. Preston, who had been slumped in his chair like a discarded marionette, slowly lifted his head. Out of everyone in the room, he understood the brutal reality of that $27 million figure better than anyone else. He worked in the financial sector. He knew exactly what an all-cash acquisition of that size meant for his future. He knew it made me practically untouchable. The realization that he had tried to write a bouncing $5,000 check to a woman worth nearly $30 million physically sickened him. He looked as though he were going to vomit right onto his gold-rimmed porcelain plate. The supreme arrogance he had walked in with was replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. He knew I possessed the endless resources required to drag his federal receivership out for years, ensuring he never worked in the logistics industry again. He had brought a knife to a nuclear detonation, and the fallout was currently raining down on his expensive silk tie. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed, marking the half hour. The melodic sound seemed exceptionally loud in the devastated room. The aroma of the roasted turkey and the candied pecans now felt cloying and rancid, a sickening reminder of the fake holiday cheer that had initiated this ambush. I let the reality of the $27 million settle over them, allowing the immense pressure of that number to crush the last remaining fragments of their denial. They had spent the entire evening demanding I hand over my modest carriage house, insisting I make a sacrifice for the family. Now, they were acutely aware that I possessed the capital to buy their sprawling colonial estate, demolish it to the foundation, and build a parking lot, without making a dent in my principal balance. The strict, toxic hierarchy they had utilized to govern my life and extract my compliance evaporated in the span of a single heartbeat. The golden child was reduced to the wife of a bankrupt fraud. The booming patriarch was exposed as a powerless spectator. The condescending mother was rendered entirely mute. They were trapped in the wreckage of their own making, staring at the architect of their destruction. I waited, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany table, anticipating the inevitable, sickening pivot. I knew my family well enough to predict their next move. The pride that had fueled their cruelty would vanish, replaced instantly by the parasitic greed that dictated their every action. The transition from predators to sycophants was about to begin. The lingering echo of the $27 million figure settled over the ruined Thanksgiving table, bringing with it a profound, sickening psychological pivot. The transition did not happen gradually. It occurred in the span of a single collective heartbeat. The rigid, unforgiving family hierarchy that had dictated my entire existence snapped, and the resulting scramble for position was entirely devoid of shame. My parents did not pause to process the moral implications of Preston's fraud or the impending destruction of their eldest daughter's life. The moment they realized the true center of financial gravity rested at my end of the table, they discarded their golden child without a second thought. Richard was the first to break the stunned silence. The booming, tyrannical patriarch who just minutes prior had threatened to cast me out into the street underwent a grotesque physical transformation. The dark, furious flush drained from his face, replaced by a pale, strained complexion. He reached up with trembling fingers and adjusted the knot of his silk tie, pulling it away from his throat as if he suddenly needed more oxygen. He forced a smile. It was a hollow, desperate contortion of his facial muscles that failed to reach his eyes. He let out a short, high-pitched chuckle, a sound so unnatural it seemed to scrape against the formal wallpaper of the dining room. "My brilliant girl," Richard murmured, the oily sweetness of his tone turning my stomach. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, attempting to project an aura of proud, paternal camaraderie. He looked at the glossy press release and then back at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, calculating hunger. He began to rewrite 3 decades of history right before my eyes. "I always knew you possessed this caliber of potential, Emerson," he lied, his voice dripping with an artificial warmth. "I pushed you. I was harsh on you. Yes, but only because I saw the genius hiding beneath the surface. The corporate world is ruthless. It eats the weak. My tough love was a crucible. I forged you into a chief executive officer capable of navigating these waters." He was attempting to claim credit for the empire I built in spite of him. He spun his years of emotional abuse, his public mockery of my career, and his blatant favoritism into a masterclass of strategic parenting. He expected me to accept this revised narrative, to thank him for the relentless cruelty that forced me into isolation. Patricia seamlessly followed her husband's lead, stepping into her new role as the fawning mother of a Silicon Valley titan. She leaned across the table, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She did not notice or care that the sleeve of her expensive blouse was dragging directly through the puddle of spilled red wine spreading outward from Richard's overturned glass. Her diamond bracelets chimed a frantic rhythm as she extended her hands toward me, her palms upturned in a gesture of desperate supplication. The indignant revulsion that had twisted her features just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a radiant, predatory adoration. "We are so incredibly proud of you, darling," Patricia cooed. The pitch of her voice was saccharine, mirroring the tone she reserved for the wealthiest patrons at her country club. "To think, our own daughter securing an 8-figure buyout. It is breathtaking. But a sum like that, it requires delicate handling. You need a trusted team to protect those assets from outsiders." She glanced at Richard, prompting him to deliver the pitch they were silently coordinating through shared, greedy glances. "Your mother is right," Richard interjected smoothly, seamlessly adopting the role of a seasoned financial advisor. "Navigating capital gains on an acquisition of this scale is a minefield. You need an experienced hand to guide your portfolio. We can set up a family trust. I have the connections to shield your principal and maximize your dividends. We can manage this together." They were offering to take control of my wealth under the guise of parental protection. The audacity was staggering. They had spent the evening trying to force me to surrender a historic property to a criminal, and now they were volunteering to manage a multi-million-dollar fortune. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as an endless, uncomplaining, automated teller machine, and they were frantically trying to secure the PIN code. Yet the most disturbing reaction did not come from my parents. It came from the woman sitting beside the ruined logistics executive. Victoria stopped crying. The hysterical, breathless sobbing that had racked her frame ceased with the sudden, jarring finality of a flipped switch. She lowered her hands from her face. Her pristine makeup was smeared dark streaks of mascara staining her cheeks, but the panic in her eyes was entirely gone. She looked at the glossy press release resting on top of the foreclosure folder. I watched the gears turning behind her cold, calculating eyes. The survival instinct of a lifelong socialite overrode any residual loyalty she held for her husband. She realized Preston was a sinking ship, but her sister had just arrived in a luxury lifeboat. Victoria reached for her linen napkin and wiped the dark streaks from her face with a harsh, unfeeling motion. She sat up straight, squaring her shoulders, forcing her shattered entitlement back into place. She turned her gaze toward me, and the expression she wore was devoid of remorse, humility, or gratitude. It was pure, unadulterated expectation. $27 million, Victoria stated, her voice devoid of its previous frantic pitch. She spoke the number as a calculation, weighing the digits against her own impending ruin. She extended her hand across the table, mirroring our mother's gesture, but her palm was face down, expectant and demanding. If you have that kind of capital sitting in a private account, Emerson Victoria began, her tone hardening into a sharp, commanding edge. Then $4.5 million is barely a fraction of your net worth. You can write off Preston's entire debt portfolio tomorrow morning and still have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime. She did not ask for a loan. She did not beg for mercy. She demanded a multi-million-dollar write-off as if it were a simple, overdue favor. We are family, she continued, weaponizing the very concept they had used to isolate me. You cannot sit there with that kind of wealth and watch your own sister lose her home. You have a moral obligation to fix this. It is a simple act of family unity. You clear the ledger with Obsidian Asset Management, you release the liens on our property, and we can all move past this unfortunate misunderstanding. She framed the forgiveness of a catastrophic corporate default as a minor adjustment to a ledger. She believed my years of grueling, isolated labor existed solely to serve as a safety net for her reckless, gated community lifestyle. She expected me to sacrifice a significant portion of my newfound capital to maintain the very illusion she had used to belittle me for decades. I sat motionless in my antique chair, observing the 4 people surrounding the ruined holiday feast. The turkey was cold. The wine was soaking into the lace. The facade of the affluent, untouchable Charleston family lay in tatters on the floor. My father was grinning like a sycophant. My mother was ruining her expensive blouse to reach me. My sister was demanding a multi-million-dollar handout to save her country club memberships. And Preston, the architect of the evening's disaster, remained slumped in silent, sweating terror, realizing his wife was perfectly willing to trade whatever remained of his dignity for a clean balance sheet. They had revealed the dark, hollow core of their existence. Their affection was transactional, their loyalty was tied strictly to net worth, and their pride was entirely negotiable. They were waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to accept their new inverted reality and write the checks that would secure their comfort. I looked at their greedy, expectant faces, feeling the cool brass of my grandfather's fountain pen resting in the shadows of my pocket. The stage was finally set for the curtain to fall, and I possessed the exact words required to permanently sever the strings they were so desperately trying to attach to my wrists. The dining room was a portrait of total devastation. I surveyed the 4 strangers groveling around the ruined feast. The burning resentment that had fueled my long, sleepless nights of coding, the bitter, agonizing sting of their constant rejection, it was all gone. I did not feel a triumphant surge of adrenaline or a burning desire to scream. I felt nothing but profound, peaceful detachment. The people sitting at this table were no longer the terrifying giants of my childhood. They were just 4 broken, greedy individuals drowning in a catastrophe of their own creation. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and pushed my antique chair backward. The wooden legs scraped against the polished floorboards, a sharp sound cutting through the frantic, pleading hum of my parents' voices. I stood up, taking my time to smooth the wrinkles from my dark dress. I ran my hands down the expensive fabric with deliberate care, enjoying the sensation of reclaiming my physical space. I looked down at them, forcing them to tilt their heads upward to meet my gaze. I turned my attention to Victoria first. Her hand was still extended across the lace, her palm waiting for a multi-million-dollar handout to erase her husband's crimes. "You are demanding a bailout to save your gated community lifestyle," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You want me to write off a catastrophic corporate default as a simple favor. But you are forgetting the original reason you invited me to this dinner, Victoria." I pointed to the stark white quitclaim deed still resting on my empty porcelain plate. "You brought that envelope tonight to steal my home," I reminded her. "You thought you could bully a simple freelancer into surrendering her inheritance. But the truth is, your fake Savannah expansion and your ticking clock were entirely pointless. You spent the entire evening begging for a prize that did not even exist." Victoria blinked her extended hand, faltering, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Grandpa was far more observant than anyone in this room ever realized. I explained, letting the memory of the sharp, quiet patriarch echo in my words. He saw right through the expensive country club facade our parents maintained. He knew your profound sense of entitlement, Victoria, and he recognized the hollow, performative nature of the man you married. He knew that the moment he passed away, you would all circle my inheritance like vultures. I watched the color drain from her face anew as she realized she was not just outsmarted by me, but by the very man whose wealth funded her childhood. 3 years ago, before his death, he secretly met with a team of private estate attorneys outside of Charleston. I continued outlining the ironclad legal defense that had protected me all along. He did not leave the carriage house to me in a standard will. He knew Richard would contest a standard will in probate court. Instead, he placed the physical deed into an irrevocable living trust. The legal terminology landed like a physical blow. Victoria slowly withdrew her hand, clutching her napkin to her chest. "I was named the sole trustee and the exclusive beneficiary," I stated. "The parameters of that trust explicitly forbid the property from ever being used as collateral for any commercial loans. It shields the real estate from being transferred, sold, or leveraged by any other family member under any circumstances. Your entire plan to steal my sanctuary was legally dead years before you ever slid that envelope across this table. Even if I had signed your quitclaim deed tonight, the city courts would have rejected the transfer immediately." Victoria slumped back into her chair. The realization that she had been thoroughly outmaneuvered from the grave broke the last fragile piece of her spirit. She stared blankly at the floral centerpiece, paralyzed by the totality of her defeat. I shifted my gaze to Preston. The former logistics titan was trembling, a sheen of cold sweat coating his pale face. He looked up at me with hollow, defeated eyes, waiting for the final verdict. "As for your debt portfolio, Preston," I said, my tone devoid of mercy, "there will be no family discount. There will be no restructuring plan, and there will certainly be no bridge loans. You tried to commit check fraud in my presence to steal a property you had no legal right to touch." He opened his mouth, perhaps to utter one last pathetic excuse, but his vocal cords failed him. "My legal team is already prepared." I promised him, ensuring he understood the exact timeline of his impending ruin. "We will initiate the asset seizure process at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Obsidian Asset Management will liquidate your failing warehouses. We will freeze your remaining personal accounts, repossess your leased luxury vehicles, and notify your remaining investors of your insolvency. You have until Sunday night to clear your personal belongings out of your corner office." Preston let out a hollow, broken sob. It was a pathetic, ragged sound that echoed off the formal wallpaper. He buried his face in his hands, mourning the death of his unearned pride. The reality of Monday morning was inescapable, and he knew he lacked the resources to fight a holding company with $27 million in liquid capital. Richard and Patricia began to speak at once, their voices a frantic, overlapping chorus of desperate negotiation. My father pleaded with me to sit back down to discuss wealth management, promising that we could find a rational, lucrative solution if we just operated as a unified front. My mother reached for my hand again, her voice cracking as she begged me not to walk away from my own blood. I ignored their pleas. They were negotiating with a version of me that no longer existed. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and closed my fingers around the cold, textured metal of my grandfather's vintage brass pen. I pulled it free, holding the heavy instrument up to the light. It was the tool that signed the acquisition, the symbol of the bedrock foundation I had built in secret. With my free hand, I unzipped the small side compartment of my leather satchel. I bypassed my phone and extracted a single, crisp $100 bill. I stepped forward, leaning slightly over the ruined feast. The smell of the cold turkey and the spilled bourbon made my stomach turn, but I maintained my steady, deliberate pace. I placed the green currency directly onto the white lace, right over the spreading stain of my father's overturned red wine. I brought the brass fountain pen down, using the heavy vintage instrument as a paperweight to pin the cash firmly to the table. I looked directly into my mother's wide, pleading eyes. For the dry cleaning, I told her, my voice dropping to a glacial, unfeeling whisper. I turned my back on the dining table. I did not wait for a response. I adjusted the strap of my satchel over my shoulder and began walking toward the arched doorway leading out to the main hall. Behind me, the chaotic symphony of their despair reached a fever pitch. Richard demanded I come back, his executive tone cracking into a desperate plea. Patricia sobbed my name. Victoria remained silent, lost in the wreckage of her social standing, while Preston wept into his hands. I did not break my stride. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the dining room faded the moment I stepped into the long, hardwood corridor. I walked past the framed photographs lining the walls, the pictures that chronicled decades of their pristine, manufactured perfection. For years, walking down this hall felt like a reminder of my isolation. Tonight, it felt like a victory lap. I reached the heavy oak front door, grasping the cool brass handle and pulling it open. The crisp coastal autumn air washed over me, instantly clearing the stifling scent of their desperate greed from my lungs. The night was dark and quiet, the manicured lawns of the historic district glowing softly under the pale moonlight. At the end of the long brick driveway, a sleek black town car sat idling. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path forward. The driver, seeing me emerge onto the porch, stepped out and opened the rear passenger door, waiting respectfully. I walked down the steps, hearing the faint, muffled sound of my parents still arguing inside the house. The noise was distant, irrelevant, and fading fast. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, and the driver closed the door with a solid, comforting thud. The engine hummed quietly as the car pulled away from the curb, navigating the tree-lined streets of Charleston. I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the estate disappear into the shadows, leaving their toxic history far behind me, stepping into my new life, undeniably and permanently free. The leather seat of the town car was cool against my skin, offering a grounding contrast to the stifling heat I had just escaped. As the vehicle glided through the historic oak-lined streets of Charleston, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt felt like a steady heartbeat. I watched the sprawling colonial estates roll past my window, their grand facades illuminated by soft golden porch lights. From the outside, they projected an image of flawless domestic tranquility. Yet, having just walked away from the wreckage of my own family's dining room, I understood the terrifying gap between a pristine exterior and a decaying foundation. The silence in the car provided the space I needed to process the true tragedy of the evening. The fallout was never really about the $27 million, nor was it about the distressed debt portfolio or the fraudulent check. Those were merely the symptoms of a much deeper, more insidious disease. The real catastrophe was a generational failure of parenting. Growing up in a traditional American culture that often equates visible wealth with moral virtue, my parents lost the plot early on. Richard and Patricia confused the pursuit of the American dream with the accumulation of country club memberships and luxury leases. They viewed their children not as autonomous individuals requiring guidance, but as extensions of their own fragile egos. In their minds, parenting was indistinguishable from a public relations campaign. When a family structure prioritizes social status over emotional awareness, the results are devastating. My parents demanded performance over authenticity. They taught us that love was a conditional currency, distributed only when we elevated their standing in the eyes of their affluent peers. Look at Victoria, the golden child. It is easy to view her as the villain of this story, the entitled sister demanding a multi-million-dollar handout to save her country club lifestyle. But sitting in the quiet dark of the back seat, I felt an unexpected pang of sorrow for her. She was not born with that cold, calculating entitlement. She was molded into it. Richard and Patricia shielded her from the consequences of her actions, rewarding her superficial achievements while ignoring her lack of substance. They handicapped her. By constantly praising her proximity to wealth, even when that wealth was an illusion crafted by a desperate, failing executive, they stripped her of the resilience required to survive the real world. When the facade finally collapsed, tonight, she possessed no internal compass to guide her through the wreckage. Her parents had given her a crown, but they forgot to teach her how to build the kingdom. Conversely, their neglect forged my survival. By casting me as the resident disappointment, they unintentionally granted me the freedom of invisibility. I was spared the crushing weight of their expectations. The isolation hurt a deep, bruising ache that characterized my early 20s. But it also forced me to seek validation internally. This is the paramount responsibility of raising a child, providing a secure, emotional baseline rooted in honesty and fairness. Children possess an innate, terrifyingly sharp radar for hypocrisy. When parents preach the values of hard work but actively reward deception, the child internalizes the deceit. Richard and Patricia praised Preston's empty corporate buzzwords while mocking the grueling 80-hour weeks I spent writing code. They taught us that appearing successful was far more valuable than actually achieving success. The only antidote to that toxicity was my grandfather. He represented the true core of traditional family values. He understood that long-term guidance requires a parent or guardian to be a steady anchor, regardless of the shifting social tides. He did not care about the brand of my shoes or the zip code of my address. He cared about the integrity of my handshake and the sharpness of my mind. By slipping that vintage brass fountain pen into my hand, he transferred a legacy of grit and clear-eyed observation. He provided the emotional awareness my parents lacked, recognizing my worth long before my bank account verified it. We must ask ourselves what we are truly passing down to the next generation. Are we handing them a blueprint for a sturdy foundation, or are we just teaching them how to paint over rot? True family responsibility means cultivating an environment where honesty is rewarded, even when it is uncomfortable. It means treating children with inherent fairness, refusing to pit siblings against one another in a gladiatorial contest for affection. If we fail to instill these values, we risk raising adults who will sell their own integrity for a fleeting moment of applause, just as my family attempted to do tonight. Sometimes the only way to break a cycle of generational trauma is to stand up, name the dysfunction, and walk out the front door. It requires a terrifying leap into the unknown, leaving behind the only history you have ever known, to forge a path defined by your own standards. If you have ever found yourself sitting at a table where your worth was measured in currency rather than character, know that you are not alone. If you have ever had to become your own anchor because the people who were supposed to protect you chose to protect their illusions instead, your story holds immense power. I invite you to join a community of people who understand the profound strength required to walk away. Please subscribe to the Revenge Order channel. Share your experiences in the comments, and let us continue to build a space where truth outshines the facade. As the town car merged onto the highway, leaving the historic district behind, I watched the sprawling oaks give way to the open, starlit expanse of the South Carolina coastline. I thought about Richard and Patricia, sitting in the ruins of their ruined feast. Will the shock of this evening force them to look inward? Will the silence of their empty estate breed genuine introspection, prompting them to question the hollow metrics they use to measure a life? Or will they simply sweep the shattered crystal under the rug, invent a new comforting lie for their country club friends, and continue building fresh castles on the very same sand? I may never know the answer, But as the cool night air seeped through the glass, I realized the true victory was not the $27 million, nor the look of terror on their faces. The true victory was realizing that for the first time in my life, their answer no longer mattered.